The sound of sneakers squeaking against polished concrete echoed through the empty hallway of Roosevelt High School. It was 3:47 p.m., and most students had already rushed home or gathered in the parking lot, eager to escape another mundane Tuesday. But in the boys' locker room, 5 figures stood in a tight circle around a sixth, a lean boy with dark hair who clutched his gym bag protectively against his chest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "Come on, newbie," sneered the tallest of the group, his letterman jacket bearing the name Davidson in bold letters. "School tradition. All the fresh meat has to earn their place here." The new boy's eyes darted toward the exit, but 2 other students had already positioned themselves there, arms crossed, blocking any chance of escape. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the rows of metal lockers that lined the walls like silent witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. "I don't want any trouble," the newcomer said quietly, his voice steady. Despite the obvious tension, there was something in his tone, a controlled calm that seemed oddly out of place for someone cornered by 5 upperclassmen. Davidson laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Trouble? Nah, this isn't trouble. This is just us getting acquainted. Right, boys?" The others chuckled in agreement, closing the circle tighter. None of them noticed the way the new boy's grip shifted slightly on his bag, or how his stance had subtly changed, feet positioned shoulder width apart, weight evenly distributed. They were too busy enjoying what they assumed would be easy entertainment. "Strip," Davidson commanded, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Everything. Then maybe we'll talk about whether you deserve to breathe the same air as the rest of us." The new boy looked up, meeting Davidson's eyes for the first time. Something flickered there, not fear, but a cold calculation that should have served as a warning. Instead, Davidson mistook it for defiance and stepped closer. "You deaf transfer boy?" I said strip. That's when everything changed. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Chun had stood on the front steps of Roosevelt High School, staring up at the imposing brick facade that would be his home away from home for the next 2 years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, where clusters of students chatted animatedly, their voices creating a symphony of teenage energy that felt both familiar and foreign to his ears. At 17, Marcus had attended more schools than most kids his age could count on both hands. His father's job with an international construction firm meant constant relocations, Thailand for 2 years, then Japan, a brief stint in the Philippines, and now here in suburban Denver, Colorado. Each move had taught him valuable lessons about adaptation, about reading people quickly, and about the unspoken hierarchies that existed in every social environment. But this time felt different. This time, his father had promised, they were staying put. Marcus would finally have the chance to plant roots, to build lasting friendships, maybe even graduate from the same school where he'd started his junior year. The prospect both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. "You must be Marcus," a warm voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a woman in her mid-40s approaching, her auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun and a welcoming smile creasing the corners of her eyes. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, the guidance counselor." "Ready for the grand tour?" Marcus nodded, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for taking the time." As they walked through the main entrance, Mrs. Patterson launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed orientation speech. Roosevelt High School, she explained, was home to just over 2,000 students and prided itself on academic excellence, championship sports teams, and a diverse array of extracurricular activities. The building itself was a maze of interconnected hallways, each wing dedicated to different subject sciences in the East Wing, humanities in the West, arts and athletics scattered throughout. "Now, Marcus," Mrs. Patterson said as they paused. "Outside the main office, I've reviewed your transcripts, and I have to say, I'm impressed. Straight A's across the board, and your essay about cultural adaptation was particularly insightful. You'll fit right in with our honors program. Marcus smiled politely, though privately he wondered if academic success would translate to social acceptance. Intelligence, he'd learned, could sometimes be more of a liability than an asset in the complex ecosystem of high school politics. Their first stop was the cafeteria, a cavernous space filled with round tables and the lingering aroma of industrial cooking. Even empty, Marcus could envision how it would look during lunch, students segregated into their various tribes, invisible boundaries as rigid as prison walls. The food's actually not bad, Mrs. Patterson said with a chuckle. Chef Rodriguez takes pride in offering healthy options alongside the standard fare. And see that table near the windows? That's where our National Honor Society members usually gather. I have a feeling you'll be joining them soon enough. They moved on to the library, a surprisingly modern space with comfortable seating areas and state-of-the-art computer terminals. Marcus felt immediately drawn to the quiet atmosphere and the smell of books, old friends in an unfamiliar place. This is where you'll find our more studious crowd, Mrs. Patterson observed. The librarian, Mr. Hawkins, is fantastic. He can help you find anything you need, academic or otherwise. The tour continued through various classrooms, each one filled with the promise of new knowledge and new challenges. Marcus's schedule was packed with advanced placement courses, AP Literature, AP Chemistry, AP Calculus, AP World History. It would be demanding, but he welcomed the rigor. Keeping busy had always been his strategy for dealing with the loneliness that inevitably came with being the perpetual outsider. As they walked through the humanities wing, they passed a bulletin board covered with college acceptance letters and scholarship announcements. Names like Harvard, Stanford, and MIT jumped out at him, evidence of the school's academic pedigree. Roosevelt has an excellent track record with college placement, Mrs. Patterson noted, following his gaze. Our valedictorian last year received a full ride to Princeton. With your grades and background, I'm confident you'll have plenty of options when the time comes. They were heading toward the gymnasium when they encountered their first group of students, 3 girls clustered around a locker, their conversation stopping abruptly as Marcus and Mrs. Patterson approached. Ladies, Mrs. Patterson greeted them cheerfully. I'd like you to meet Marcus Chun. He's joining us from overseas. The girls exchanged glances before the tallest one, a blonde with perfectly styled hair and designer clothes, stepped forward. I'm Jessica Whitman, she said, extending a manicured hand. Welcome to Roosevelt. Where exactly did you transfer from? Most recently from Bangkok, Marcus replied, shaking her hand briefly. But we've moved around quite a bit. Bangkok? One of the other girls, a brunette with curious eyes, chimed in. That must have been amazing. Did you live in one of those floating markets we see in movies? Marcus suppressed a smile. Actually, Bangkok is a pretty modern city. I lived in a regular apartment building, went to an international school, that sort of thing. Oh, the brunette said, looking slightly disappointed. Well, still, that's so exotic. I'm Emma Rodriguez, by the way. The third girl, shorter with auburn hair and an athletic build, remained silent but offered a polite nod when Jessica gestured toward her. And this is Sarah Mitchell. She's not much of a talker until you get to know her. Nice to meet you all, Marcus said genuinely. The girls seemed friendly enough, though he could sense them sizing him up in that subtle way teenagers had of categorizing newcomers. Marcus will be in several AP classes, Mrs. Patterson added. I'm sure you'll see him around. Definitely, Jessica said, her smile brightening. If you need help finding anything or just want to sit with us at lunch, feel free. We always have room for one more. As they continued toward the gymnasium, Mrs. Patterson leaned over conspiratorially. Jessica's one of our student council representatives, very involved in school activities. Emma's captain of the debate team, and Sarah's our star soccer player. They're good kids to know. The gymnasium was impressive, a vast space with polished hardwood floors, retractable bleachers, and banners hanging from the rafters proclaiming various championship victories. The smell of rubber and floor wax transported Marcus back to similar spaces in other schools, other countries, where he'd always felt like a spectator rather than a participant. "Do you play any sports, Marcus?" Mrs. Patterson asked as they stood in the center of the court. "I've dabbled in a few things," he said carefully. It was true, though dabbling was perhaps an understatement. Years of training in Muay Thai under some of the best masters in Thailand had given him skills that most American teenagers couldn't even comprehend. But that wasn't something he typically advertised. "Well, if you're interested, we have excellent programs here. Football, basketball, soccer, wrestling, swimming, you name it. Coach Williams is always looking for talented athletes." They were examining the trophy cases that lined one wall when a commotion erupted from the direction of the locker rooms. Raised voices, the sound of something metal clanging, and then an unmistakable cry of pain. "What in the world?" Mrs. Patterson muttered, her brow furrowing with concern. The noises stopped as suddenly as they'd started, replaced by nervous laughter and what sounded like urgent whispers. Mrs. Patterson started toward the locker room area, but before she could investigate further, the door burst open and 5 boys emerged, looking flustered and slightly out of breath. The leader was a tall, broad-shouldered student with the kind of confident swagger that spoke of years spent at the top of the social hierarchy. His letterman jacket marked him as a varsity athlete, and the way the others deferred to him made his status clear, even without formal introductions. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes holding a hint of wariness. "We were just cleaning up after gym class." "Cameron Davidson," Mrs. Patterson replied, her tone suggesting a familiarity that went beyond casual acquaintance. "I trust everything is in order?" "Absolutely," Cameron replied, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just some freshmen horsing around. You know how it is. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Marcus watched the exchange with growing interest. There was clearly subtext here, unspoken tensions that went beyond a simple post-class cleanup. The other 4 boys, all wearing similar letterman jackets or team shirts, stood slightly behind Cameron, their body language suggesting both loyalty and intimidation. "This is Marcus Chun," Mrs. Patterson said, gesturing toward him. "He's new to Roosevelt." Cameron's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a moment, the 2 young men studied each other with the instinctive wariness of predators establishing territory. Marcus noticed the slight narrowing of Cameron's eyes, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Welcome to Roosevelt," Cameron said finally, his tone polite but cool. "Hope you settle in okay." "Thank you," Marcus replied simply, matching Cameron's measured tone. The tension in the air was palpable, though Mrs. Patterson seemed oblivious to it. "Cameron's our star quarterback," she said proudly. "Led the team to state finals last year." "Impressive," Marcus said, and meant it. Athletic achievement required dedication and skill, regardless of personality. Cameron's smile became more genuine at the acknowledgement. "You play football?" "Not really my sport," Marcus admitted. "What is your sport?" one of Cameron's companions asked. He was shorter than Cameron, but stockier, with the build of a wrestler or lineman. Marcus hesitated. In Thailand, Muay Thai was revered as the art of 8 limbs, a combat sport that combined striking techniques using fists, elbows, knees, and shins. It was brutal, elegant, and incredibly effective. But here in suburban America, martial arts were often viewed with suspicion or dismissed as movie fighting. "I've trained in martial arts," he said finally, "mostly for fitness and discipline." "The dumbs." Boys exchanged glances, and Marcus caught a hint of smirks being suppressed. Cameron, however, maintained his neutral expression. "Cool," Cameron said. "Well, if you ever want to try a real contact sport, wrestling team's always looking for new talent." The underlying challenge in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus simply nodded, choosing not to take the bait. Mrs. Patterson glanced at her watch. "Well, boys, I'm sure you have places to be. Marcus and I still have a few more stops on our tour." "Of course," Cameron said. "See you around, Marcus." As the group walked away, Marcus noticed the way they moved like a pack, with Cameron clearly the alpha and the others following his lead. He'd seen similar dynamics in every school he'd attended, but something about this particular group set off warning bells in his mind. "Cameron's a good kid," Mrs. Patterson said as they headed toward the arts wing. "Comes from a prominent family in town. His father owns several local businesses. Sometimes the pressure gets to him, but overall, he's a natural leader." Marcus nodded politely, though privately he reserved judgment. Leadership and intimidation often wore similar faces, and he'd learned to distinguish between the two through hard experience. The rest of the tour passed without incident. They visited the art studios, where students were working on various projects, ranging from traditional paintings to modern sculptures. The music rooms buzzed with activity, a jazz ensemble rehearsing in one space, individual students practicing piano and violin in soundproof booths. "We have an excellent performing arts program," Mrs. Patterson explained as they observed a small group of students running through what appeared to be scenes from a play. "Our drama department has won several state competitions, and our music ensembles regularly perform at regional festivals." Marcus found himself drawn to the creative energy of the space. In Bangkok, he'd spent countless hours sketching in markets and temples, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the fluid movements of Muay Thai fighters, the serene expressions of Buddhist monks. Art had been his way of processing the constant changes in his life, a form of meditation that required no language and transcended cultural barriers. "Do you have any interest in the arts?" Mrs. Patterson asked, noticing his attention. "I enjoy drawing," Marcus admitted. "Nothing formal. Just observations." "Well, Mr. Kelly teaches our advanced art classes, and he's always encouraging students to explore their creativity. I'll make sure to mention your interest." As they completed the tour back at the main office, Mrs. Patterson handed Marcus his class schedule, locker combination, and a map of the school. "Your first class tomorrow is a P literature with Miss Chun. No relation, I assume?" Marcus smiled. "Probably not, unless I have some very distant relatives I don't know about." "Well, you'll like her. She's challenging but fair, and she has a particular appreciation for diverse perspectives. Your international background will be a real asset in her class discussions." As Marcus prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I know it's never easy being a new student, especially senior year. But Roosevelt is a good school with good people. Give it a chance, and I think you'll find your place here." Marcus thanked her and stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, clutching his schedule and trying to memorize the layout of his new academic home. Students were beginning to filter out of various buildings, their voices creating a familiar soundtrack of teenage life. Some glanced in his direction with mild curiosity, but most were too absorbed in their own conversations to pay much attention to the newcomer. As he walked toward the student parking lot where his father was waiting to pick him up, Marcus replayed the events of the afternoon. The tour had been comprehensive and informative. Mrs. Patterson had been genuinely helpful, and he'd even made contact with a few potential classmates. By all accounts, it had been a successful introduction to Roosevelt High School. So why did he feel like he'd just walked through a minefield? Perhaps it was years of experience reading social dynamics, or maybe it was the instincts honed through martial arts training that taught practitioners to anticipate attacks before they materialized. Whatever the source, Marcus couldn't shake The feeling that his encounter with Cameron Davidson and his crew had been more than a casual meeting. The way they'd emerged from the locker room, disheveled and defensive. The carefully neutral expressions that didn't quite mask underlying hostility. The subtle challenge embedded in seemingly innocent questions about sports and physical contact. Marcus had seen it all before. In different schools, different countries, different languages. The dynamics were universal. Established hierarchies, territorial instincts, and the inevitable testing of newcomers to determine their place in the pecking order. But this felt different somehow. More deliberate. More dangerous. As his father's car pulled up to the curb, Marcus pushed the concerns aside. Maybe he was reading too much into what had been a perfectly normal first-day experience. Maybe years of being the outsider had made him overly paranoid about social threats that didn't actually exist. Tomorrow, he told himself, would be a fresh start. He'd focus on his classes, keep his head down, and prove himself through academic achievement rather than social maneuvering. It was a strategy that had served him well in other schools, and there was no reason it wouldn't work here. But as he climbed into the passenger seat and watched Roosevelt High School disappear in the rearview mirror, Marcus couldn't quite convince himself that tomorrow would be as simple as he hoped, because somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that Cameron Davidson wasn't the type to let challenges real or perceived go unanswered. And Marcus Chun, despite his hopes for a quiet integration into Roosevelt's social fabric, had apparently just issued one. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through Marcus's restless sleep at 6:30 am sharp. He'd been awake for the better part of an hour anyway, his mind cycling through potential scenarios for his first official day at Roosevelt High School. The pre-dawn darkness outside his bedroom window felt familiar in Bangkok. He'd often risen before sunrise to train at the local gym, the cool morning air providing relief from the oppressive heat that would dominate the later hours. Marcus rolled out of bed and moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, breakfast. With his parents, final review of his class schedule, and a mental inventory of his supplies. His mother, Dr. Linda Chun, had already left for her new position at Denver General Hospital. But she'd left behind his favorite Thai-style breakfast rice porridge with ginger and a hard-boiled egg. His father, David, sat at the kitchen table, reviewing construction blueprints while sipping black coffee. "Ready for day one?" David asked without looking up from his work. "As ready as anyone can be," Marcus replied, spooning the warm porridge. The familiar flavors grounded him. A taste of home in an increasingly foreign landscape. "Your mother wanted and me to remind you about the self-defense principles we discussed," David said, finally meeting his son's eyes. "Avoid trouble when possible, but don't let anyone push you around unnecessarily." Marcus nodded. His parents knew about his martial arts training. They'd been the ones to encourage it during their time in Thailand. Recognizing that their son needed something to channel his restless energy and provide consistency across their many relocations. What they didn't fully understand was the extent of his abilities, the countless hours he'd spent in Bangkok's most prestigious training camps, learning from masters who'd competed at the highest levels. "I'll be fine, Dad. Just planning to keep my head down and focus on academics." David smiled, but Marcus caught a flicker of concern in his expression. "Sometimes circumstances don't allow for that luxury, son. Just use good judgment." The 20-minute drive to Roosevelt High gave Marcus time to mentally prepare for the day ahead. His first class, a P Literature with Miss Chun, was scheduled for 8:15 a.m. in room 204, then a P Chemistry, lunch, a P Calculus, and finally a P World History. It was an aggressive schedule, but Marcus preferred staying busy to having idle time where his mind could wander. The student parking lot was already filling up when David dropped him off. Clusters of teenagers gathered around various vehicles, the popular kids congregating near expensive SUVs and sports cars. The more alternative students claiming space near older sedans and compact cars covered in band stickers. Marcus observed these tribal formations with the analytical eye of an anthropologist, cataloging the subtle signs of status and belonging that seemed universal across cultures. He was retrieving his backpack from his father's car when a familiar voice called out behind him. "Marcus, hey Marcus." He turned to see Emma Rodriguez jogging toward him, her debate team captain confidence evident in her purposeful stride. She was dressed more casually than the previous day: jeans, a Roosevelt High School sweatshirt, and sneakers that had clearly seen plenty of use. "I was hoping I'd catch you," she said, slightly out of breath. "Jessica and Sarah are already inside, but I wanted to ask if you'd like to sit with us at lunch today. The first day can be overwhelming, and the cafeteria is basically social warfare. If you don't know the terrain." Marcus felt genuine gratitude for the gesture. "That's really kind of you. I'd appreciate it." "Great. We usually lay at the table near the big windows around 11:45. Jessica likes to people watch between classes." Emma grinned. "Fair warning though, she's going to ask you about a million questions about living overseas. She's convinced international experiences are the key to getting into Ivy League schools." As they walked toward the main entrance, Emma provided a running commentary on various students they passed. The theater kids gathered near the arts wing entrance. The athletes clustered around the gym doors. The academic achievers already heading toward the library for pre-class study sessions. "See that group over there?" Emma nodded toward a collection of students wearing Letterman jackets and team shirts. "That's Cameron Davidson's crew. They basically run the social scene here, at least among the jock crowd." Marcus spotted Cameron immediately. His height and commanding presence made him hard to miss. The quarterback was holding court near a row of lockers, surrounded by the same 4 boys from yesterday's encounter, plus several new faces. Their body language suggested easy camaraderie mixed with obvious deference to Cameron's authority. "They seem popular," Marcus observed carefully. "Popular is one word for it," Emma replied, her tone neutral but with an undercurrent Marcus couldn't quite identify. "Cameron's family has a lot of influence in town, and he's genuinely talented athletically. But sometimes that kind of power can go to people's heads." Before Marcus could ask for clarification, the warning bell echoed through the hallways, signaling 5 minutes until first period. Students began dispersing toward their respective classrooms, the easy morning socializing replaced by the focused energy of academic pursuit. "I better run," Emma said. "I've got a government first period, and Mrs. Williams hates tardiness. See you at lunch." Marcus navigated the hallways using the map Mrs. Patterson had provided, dodging clusters of students and trying to memorize the layout for future reference. Room 204 was located on the second floor of the humanities wing, and he arrived with 2 minutes to spare. Ms. Chun, despite the shared surname, she appeared to be Korean American rather than Chinese, was arranging papers on her desk when Marcus entered. The classroom had the comfortable lived-in feel of a space where serious learning took place. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with everything from classic literature to contemporary novels, and student artwork decorated the remaining space. "You must be Marcus," Ms. Chun said, looking up with a warm smile. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you'd be joining us. Please take any available seat." The classroom was filling up with students who appeared serious about their academics. Marcus chose a desk in the 3rd row, close enough to demonstrate engagement, but not so close as to seem overeager. As his classmates settled in, he recognized a few faces from the previous day's tour, including Sarah Mitchell, the soccer player who'd been part of Jessica's group. Sarah offered a brief nod of recognition before turning her attention to the front of the room. Marcus was struck by how different she seemed in this academic setting, more focused, more purposeful than during the casual hallway encounter. "Welcome to Advanced Placement Literature," Miss Chun began once the late bell had rung. This year, we'll be exploring the concept of identity through various literary lenses: cultural identity, personal identity, and the ways in which literature both shapes and reflects our understanding of ourselves and others. She gestured toward Marcus. We're fortunate to have a new perspective joining us today. Marcus has recently transferred from an international school in Bangkok, and I'm sure his global experiences will enrich our discussions throughout the year. Marcus felt the familiar weight of being singled out as the exotic newcomer, but Ms. Chun's approach seemed genuinely interested rather than tokenistic. Several students turned to look at him with curiosity rather than the judgment he'd come to expect. Our first unit will focus on narratives of displacement and adaptation, Ms. Chin continued. We'll be reading works by authors who wrote about the immigrant experience, cultural transition, and the challenges of maintaining identity across borders. The coincidence wasn't lost on Marcus. Literature about displacement and adaptation themes that had defined his entire adolescence. As Ms. Chun outlined their reading list, which included works by Amy Tan, Jhumpa Lahiri, and Viet Thanh Nguyen, Marcus felt a spark of genuine enthusiasm for what promised to be personally relevant material. Your first assignment, Ms. Chun announced, as the period drew to a close, will be a personal narrative essay about a time when you felt like an outsider looking in. It can be a specific incident or a broader reflection on identity formation. 5 pages due next Friday. As students gathered their belongings and headed toward their next classes, Sarah Mitchell approached Marcus's desk. "Hey," she said quietly. "I wanted to apologize if yesterday felt a bit overwhelming. Jessica means well, but she can be a lot when you first meet her." "She seemed nice," Marcus replied honestly. "You all did." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her typically serious face. "Good. Sometimes people get the wrong impression about our group. They think we're stuck up or exclusive, but we're really just focused on our goals." "What are your goals?" Marcus asked as they walked out of the classroom together. "College, primarily. Jessica wants Harvard for pre-law. Emma's aiming for Georgetown for international relations, and I'm hoping for a soccer scholarship to Stanford or UCLA. She paused. "What about you?" Marcus considered the question. His academic achievements would open doors to top universities, but he'd never allowed himself to think too far ahead. Constant relocations had taught him to focus on immediate challenges rather than long-term planning. "Still figuring that out," he admitted. "Maybe something in international business or cultural studies." "That makes sense, given your background. Have you thought about our model UN team? Emma's the president, and they're always looking for people with real international experience." They'd reached the stairwell leading to the science wing, where Marcus's AP chemistry class was located. Sarah's next class was apparently in the opposite direction. "I'll think about it," Marcus said. "Thanks for the suggestion. See you at lunch." Sarah replied before disappearing into the flow of students changing classes. AP chemistry proved to be both challenging and familiar. Mr. Rodriguez, Emma's father, Marcus realized with surprise, was clearly passionate about his subject and had designed the curriculum to push students toward genuine understanding rather than mere memorization. The lab component would be particularly demanding, requiring precise technique and careful observation skills. Marcus found himself seated next to a quiet boy named Tyler Williams, who seemed more interested in his smartphone than the periodic table Mr. Rodriguez was discussing. When Marcus introduced himself, Tyler barely looked up from his screen. "Yeah, cool," Tyler mumbled. "You're the transfer kid from Asia, right? My dad mentioned something about it." It took Marcus a moment to make the connection. "Your dad?" "Coach Williams. He runs the wrestling program and helps with football conditioning." Tyler finally put down his phone and gave Marcus a more thorough assessment. "Dad's always scouting for new talent. You look like you might have some athletic potential." Marcus deflected with a non-committal response, but he filed away the information. In a school this size, word traveled quickly, and apparently his arrival had already generated discussion among the coaching staff. The morning classes passed in. A blur of introductions, syllabus reviews, and initial assessments. By the time lunch period arrived, Marcus was feeling cautiously optimistic about the academic environment at Roosevelt High. The teachers seemed competent and engaged. His classmates appeared serious about their studies, and the curriculum promised to be both rigorous and relevant. The cafeteria, however, was an entirely different ecosystem. Emma hadn't been exaggerating about the social warfare aspect. The large space was clearly divided into distinct territories, each claimed by different groups with their own unspoken rules and hierarchies. The athletes dominated the center tables, their letterman jackets and team shirts serving as uniforms of status. The academic high achievers clustered near the windows, their conversations punctuated by the rustle of homework being compared and study groups being organized. Marcus spotted Jessica's distinctive blonde hair near the promised window table and made his way through the maze of chairs and backpacks. Jessica waved enthusiastically when she saw him approaching, and Emma gestured toward an empty chair they'd clearly saved for him. "How's the first day treating you so far?" Jessica asked as Marcus sat down with his lunch tray. "Better than expected." Marcus replied honestly, "The classes seem really solid." "Wait until you get your first major assignments," Sarah warned with a grin. "Roosevelt doesn't mess around with academic expectations." As they ate, the conversation flowed easily through various topics: upcoming assignments, weekend plans, gossip about teachers and classmates. Marcus found himself relaxing in their company, appreciating their blend of academic seriousness and teenage normalcy. It was Emma who first noticed the shift in the cafeteria's atmosphere. Oh, she murmured, her gaze fixed on something behind Marcus's shoulder. "Looks like Cameron's holding court again." Marcus turned to see what had captured her attention. At the central cluster of tables, Cameron Davidson was standing with his arms crossed, his expression serious as he addressed his usual crew. But there was something different about the scene, an edge of tension that hadn't been present during their brief encounter the previous day. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, following Emma's gaze. "Hard to tell from here," Jessica replied, but her voice carried a note of concern. "But Cameron looks intense." As if sensing their observation, Cameron's head turned in their direction. For a moment, his gaze locked with Marcus's across the crowded cafeteria. There was something calculating in that look, a cold assessment that made Marcus's instincts prickle with warning. Then Cameron smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes, and turned back to his conversation. "That was weird," Emma observed. Marcus was about to agree when a commotion erupted from the direction of the lunch line. A smaller student, probably a freshman based on his nervous demeanor and oversized backpack, had apparently collided with one of Cameron's crew members, sending a tray of food clattering to the floor. The noise drew immediate attention from nearby tables, and Marcus watched as the situation unfolded with the slow-motion clarity of someone trained to read potential violence. The crew member, a stocky boy Marcus remembered from yesterday's locker room encounter, had grabbed the freshman by the front of his shirt. Other students were backing away, creating a circle of empty space around the confrontation. The freshman was apologizing repeatedly, his voice high with panic, but his words seemed to be falling on deaf ears. "Someone should do something," Sarah muttered, but her voice suggested she knew how unlikely intervention was in Roosevelt's social hierarchy. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded difficult decisions. Every instinct told him to stay seated, to avoid drawing attention to himself on his first day. But watching the smaller student's obvious terror stirred something deeper, memories of being young and vulnerable, of feeling powerless in the face of casual cruelty. He was halfway out of his chair when Cameron Davidson appeared beside the confrontation. For a moment, Marcus thought the quarterback might defuse the situation. Cameron placed a hand on his crew member's shoulder and said something too quiet to hear from across the cafeteria. The stocky boy released the freshman's shirt, and several nearby students visibly relaxed. But instead of dismissing the incident, Cameron turned his attention to the trembling freshman. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but the boy's expression shifted from relief to renewed terror. Whatever Cameron was saying, it wasn't offering comfort or resolution. The freshman nodded rapidly, then bent to clean up the scattered food with shaking hands. Cameron watched for a moment, then returned to his table as if nothing had happened. The entire incident had lasted less than 2 minutes, but its impact rippled through the nearby tables in the form of nervous whispers and careful glances. "What just happened?" Marcus asked quietly. Emma exchanged glances with Jessica and Sarah before answering. "Cameron established order," she said carefully. "That's what he does. By intimidating a freshman?" "By maintaining the social structure," Jessica corrected, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the explanation. "Look, it's not ideal, but it keeps things from getting out of hand. Better Cameron's crew handles minor incidents than having chaos in the cafeteria." Marcus stared at her, trying to process the logic. "So intimidation is acceptable?" "It's complicated," Sarah said softly. "Cameron's not evil. He's actually prevented some genuinely bad situations from escalating. But his methods can be harsh." The conversation was interrupted by the lunch period warning bell. Students began clearing their tables and heading toward their afternoon classes, the cafeteria incident already fading into the background noise of high school life. As Marcus gathered his belongings, he found himself looking toward Cameron's table one more time. The quarterback was laughing at something one of his friends had said, his earlier intensity replaced by easy camaraderie. But when Cameron's gaze swept across the cafeteria, it lingered for just a moment on Marcus, long enough to feel deliberate. Marcus's afternoon classes passed in a haze of distracted attention. A P-Calculus with Mr. Thompson proved challenging but manageable, and a P-World History with Mrs. Baker promised to be fascinating given her emphasis on cultural exchange and global interconnectedness. But throughout both periods, Marcus found his mind returning to the cafeteria incident and the strange undercurrents he'd observed. By the time the final bell rang at 3:15 p.m., Marcus had reached a conclusion that both troubled and clarified his situation at Roosevelt High School. Cameron Davidson wasn't just a popular athlete with a commanding presence. He was the unofficial enforcer of the school's social order, using intimidation and the threat of violence to maintain control. And for reasons Marcus couldn't fully understand, he seemed to have already attracted Cameron's attention. As students flooded toward the exits, Marcus took his time gathering his materials and organizing his locker. The hallways gradually emptied, leaving behind the familiar after-school quiet that he'd experienced during yesterday's tour. He was walking toward the main entrance when he heard voices echoing from the direction of the gymnasium. Male voices raised in what sounded like confrontation. Marcus hesitated, every rational instinct telling him to mind his own business and head home. But curiosity won out over caution. Following the sound, Marcus found himself approaching the boys' locker room where he'd first encountered Cameron's crew the previous day. The voices were clearer, now multiple speakers, with one voice clearly dominant over the others. Think you can just walk around here like you own the place? I was just trying to get to my locker. Your locker? This isn't your locker room, fresh meat. This is our space. Marcus recognized the dominant voice. Now it belonged to the stocky boy who'd confronted the freshman at lunch. And unless he was mistaken, the frightened voice responding belonged to that same freshman. He crept closer to the locker room entrance, staying in the shadows of the hallway. Through the partially open door, he could see 5 figures surrounding a sixth, exactly the scene that had greeted him in yesterday's tour. Except this time he could see the victim clearly. The freshman looked even younger than Marcus had initially thought, probably no more than 14 years old. His backpack lay on the floor beside him, its contents scattered across the concrete. The 5 upperclassmen Cameron's usual crew formed a loose circle around him, their body language radiating practiced intimidation. "Here's how this works," the stocky boy continued. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, you bring us $20. Call it a membership fee for using our facilities." "I don't have $20, the freshman whispered. "Then you better find it. Or find somewhere else to change for gym class." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. The extortion was blatant, casual, clearly part of an established pattern. And none of the other 4 boys seemed the least bit concerned about what they were witnessing. "What if I report this?" the freshman asked, his voice barely audible. The laughter that followed was cold and harsh. "Report it to who? Coach Williams? He's got 2 state championships thanks to our varsity team. Mrs. Patterson? She's got enough problems dealing with real disciplinary issues." The stocky boy stepped closer to the freshman, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Besides, accidents happen all the time in high school, especially to kids who don't know how to keep their mouths shut." That was enough. Marcus stepped through the locker room doorway, his footsteps deliberately loud on the concrete floor. The 5 boys whipped around in surprise, their casual confidence evaporating as they realized they'd been discovered. "Gentlemen," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm he'd learned from years of martial arts training. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The stocky boy Marcus remembered his name was Derek something from lunch period introductions, tried to regain his composure. "This doesn't concern you, transfer boy. Keep walking." "Actually, I think it does concern me," Marcus replied, moving further into the locker room. His positioning was careful, close enough to intervene if necessary, but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. "See, I'm still learning about Roosevelt's single quotes S. traditions, and I'm wondering if extortion is officially sanctioned by the administration." "Extortion?" Derek laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in the sound. "We're just explaining the social dynamics to our new friend here. By demanding $20 twice a week? By helping him understand his place." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, the same focused calm that preceded sparring matches in Bangkok's most intense training sessions. "And what place would that be?" "Bottom of the food chain," one of the other boys answered. "Where all the weak ones belong." The freshman was watching this exchange with wide, frightened eyes, clearly torn between hope for rescue and terror that the situation might escalate beyond his worst nightmares. Marcus looked at each of the 5 upperclassmen in turn, memorizing faces and positions. Derek was the obvious leader of this particular operation, but the others were clearly complicit. 2 of them twins, based on their similar features, flanked Derek on either side. The 4th boy stood near the exit, probably positioned to watch for interruptions. The 5th lingered near the lockers, his role unclear, but his attention focused entirely on Marcus. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. "You're going to apologize. He looked at the freshman. "What's your name?" "Kevin," the boy whispered. "Kevin Park. You're going to apologize to Kevin. You're going to return any money you've already taken from him. And you're going to find a different way to spend your Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." Derek's face was flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Who the hell do you think you are? You've been here 2 days, and you think you can tell us how things work?" "I think I can tell you that what you're doing is wrong," Marcus replied simply. "Wrong?" Derek stepped closer, his chest puffed out in an obvious attempt at intimidation. "You know what's wrong? Some foreign kid thinks he can walk into our school and change our rules." The racial undertone wasn't lost on Marcus, but he'd heard worse and learned not to let such provocations derail his focus. "Your rules don't include stealing from younger students. Prove we're stealing anything." Marcus glanced at Kevin, whose terrified expression suggested this wasn't his first encounter with Derek's membership fees. "Kevin, have these boys taken money from you before?" The freshman's mouth opened and closed silently. His gaze darted between Marcus and Derek, clearly calculating the risks of either answer. "Don't answer that," Derek commanded. "This conversation is over." He turned toward Kevin, clearly intending to finish what they'd started and deal with Marcus's interference later. But Marcus had spent years learning to read body language and anticipate aggressive movements. "Derek." The single word, spoken with quiet authority, stopped Derek mid-stride. He turned back toward Marcus, his face twisted with anger. "This ends now," Marcus continued. "You walk away, Kevin keeps his money, and we all pretend this never happened. Or what?" Marcus felt time slow down the way it always did before combat. His breathing deepened slightly, his stance shifted almost imperceptibly, and his awareness expanded to encompass every person and potential weapon in the room. "Or we find out whether Roosevelt's wrestling team has taught you anything useful," he said calmly. The challenge hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a simple locker room confrontation. Marcus had just declared himself willing to fight 5-on-1, odds to protect a freshman he'd met 30 seconds earlier. Derek's crew exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about how to proceed. This wasn't part of their usual script. Victims were supposed to be intimidated, not defended by unknown quantities with unsettling calm. "You're making a big mistake," Derek said finally. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But it's my mistake to make." The standoff stretched for several more seconds before Derek made his decision. "This isn't over," he announced to the room in general. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied. Derek gestured to his crew, and they began filing toward the exit. But as they reached the doorway, Derek turned back one final time. "You have no idea what you just started," he said to Marcus. "Then I guess we'll both find out together," Marcus replied. After the 5 upperclassmen had left, Marcus turned his attention to Kevin, who was still standing frozen beside the scattered contents of his backpack. "You okay?" Marcus asked gently. Kevin nodded wordlessly, then began gathering his belongings with shaking hands. Marcus knelt to help, collecting scattered notebooks and pens. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus asked as they worked. "Since school started," Kevin whispered. "They said it was normal, that all the underclassmen had to pay." Marcus felt another surge of anger at the casual cruelty of the lie. "It's not normal, Kevin, and you don't have to pay them anything. But what if they come after me now? What if they tell Cameron?" The mention of Cameron Davidson confirmed Marcus's suspicions about the quarterback's role in Roosevelt's informal power structure. "Let me worry about Cameron." Kevin's eyes widened. "You don't understand. Cameron runs this place. His dad owns half the businesses in town, and Coach Williams thinks he walks on water. If Cameron decides he doesn't like you, then Cameron and I will have a conversation," Marcus said calmly. They finished collecting Kevin's belongings in silence. As they prepared to leave the locker room, Kevin grabbed Marcus's arm. "Thank you," he said quietly. "But please be careful. These guys ... they don't just let things go." Marcus nodded, appreciating the warning even as he ignored its implicit advice. "Will you be okay getting home?" "Yeah, my mom picks me up out front." They parted ways at the main entrance, Kevin hurrying toward the parent pickup area while Marcus headed toward the student parking lot where his father would be waiting. As he walked, Marcus replayed the confrontation in his mind, analyzing his decisions and their likely consequences. He'd intervened to protect a vulnerable student from obvious abuse. By any moral standard, he'd done the right thing. But he'd also declared war on Roosevelt High School's established power structure on his second day as a student. The smart play would have been to walk away, to report what he'd witnessed to appropriate authorities, to work within the system rather than challenging it directly. But Marcus had learned long ago that systems often protected those in power at the expense of those without it. As he climbed into his father's car, Marcus made a mental note to call his old Muay Thai instructor in Bangkok. It had been several months since their last conversation, and Marcus suspected he might need some advanced training refreshers in the very near future. Derek had been right about one thing: this wasn't over, and Marcus was beginning to suspect that his quiet integration into Roosevelt High School had just become impossible. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus's intervention in the locker room, and Roosevelt High School had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Derek's crew had kept their distance, though Marcus often caught them watching him during lunch periods and between classes. Cameron Davidson maintained his polite but cold demeanor whenever their paths crossed, but there was something calculating in his eyes that suggested plans were being made. Marcus had hoped the incident would blow over naturally. He'd thrown himself into his academic work, earning praise from teachers and forming genuine friendships with Emma, Jessica, and Sarah. He'd even joined the Model UN team at Emma's insistence, where his international background proved invaluable during practice debates about global trade policies. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, as Marcus finished his AP chemistry lab and headed toward his locker, he sensed something different in the school's atmosphere. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Students moved aside more quickly than usual. The hallways felt charged with anticipation, like the air before a thunderstorm. He was retrieving his textbooks when Tyler Williams appeared beside him, nervousness radiating from every pore. "Hey, Marcus," Tyler said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Listen, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but you need to be careful after school today." Marcus looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "Derek's been talking to my dad, Coach Williams. They've been discussing team-building exercises and how certain students need to learn about Roosevelt traditions." Tyler's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think they're planning something." Before Marcus could respond, Tyler had melted back into the crowd of students heading to the final period. Marcus stood at his locker for a moment, processing the warning. The smart thing would be to leave immediately, to catch a ride with one of his new friends, or call his father for an early pickup. Instead, he closed his locker and headed to a P-World history, his mind already shifting into the focused calm he'd learned in Bangkok's training gyms. The final class period crawled by with agonizing slowness. Mrs. Baker's discussion of cultural conflict resolution felt ironically relevant. But Marcus found it difficult to concentrate on theoretical frameworks when he suspected he was about to face a very practical conflict. When the dismissal bell finally rang, Marcus deliberately took his time gathering his materials. Most students rushed toward the exits, eager to begin their afternoon activities. But Marcus had learned that sometimes the best strategy was to let opponents think they controlled the timing. The hallways emptied quickly, leaving behind the familiar after-school quiet. Marcus made his way toward the main entrance, but as he passed the gymnasium, he heard voices calling his name. "Marcus! Hey, Marcus-chan!" He turned to see Derek standing near the boys' locker room, flanked by his usual crew. But today, there were additions: 2 older students Marcus didn't recognize, both wearing varsity wrestling shirts. And standing slightly apart from the group, arms crossed and expression unreadable, was Cameron Davidson. "We need to talk," Derek called out, his voice carrying across the empty hallway. Marcus felt time slow down the way it always did before combat. His breathing deepened, his stance shifted slightly, and his awareness expanded to take in every detail of his surroundings. 6 opponents, positioned strategically to block multiple escape routes. The nearest teacher would be at least 2 hallways away. Security cameras covered the main corridors, but not the locker room area. "About what?" Marcus asked calmly, not moving closer but not backing away either. "About respect," Cameron said, speaking for the first time. "About understanding how things work at Roosevelt. I thought I understood pretty well." Derek stepped Forward, clearly relishing his role as enforcer. "You embarrassed us 3 weeks ago. Made us look weak in front of that freshman. That can't stand." Kevin Park wasn't hurting anyone. Kevin Park was learning his place, one of the wrestlers interjected. "Just like you're about to learn yours." Marcus assessed his options quickly. The hallway offered some maneuvering room, but no real tactical advantages. The locker room would be more confined, but might limit their ability to surround him effectively. Running wasn't really an option. They'd just catch him eventually, probably when he was even more isolated. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Marcus asked. Cameron smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "Just a friendly conversation, in private." The 6 boys began moving slowly toward Marcus, their formation clearly practiced. This wasn't spontaneous. They'd planned this confrontation carefully, chosen the location and timing deliberately. Marcus backed toward the locker room entrance, not out of fear but to control the tactical situation. If this was going to happen, he wanted it on terrain that favored his skills rather than their numbers. "After you," Derek said mockingly. Gesturing toward the locker room door, Marcus stepped through the entrance, his senses hyper-alert. The familiar smell of disinfectant and rubber hit him immediately, along with the echoing acoustics of the tiled space. Rows of lockers provided some cover, but the open areas near the benches would leave him exposed. The 6 boys filed in after him, Cameron taking a position near the door while the others formed their practice circle. Marcus found himself in the center of the space, exactly where he discovered Kevin Park 3 weeks earlier. "Here's how this works," Derek began, clearly enjoying his moment of perceived dominance. "You're going to strip down to your underwear, just like we were going to have that freshman do. Then you're going to apologize for interfering in our business. And then maybe, we'll let you walk out of here without any permanent damage." Marcus looked at each of them in turn, memorizing positions and calculating distances. The 2 wrestlers were the obvious physical threats, but Derek's anger made him unpredictable. The other 2 seemed to be followers rather than leaders. Cameron was the wild card, clearly in charge but holding back, perhaps planning to let his subordinates handle the actual violence. "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked. "Then we teach you some Roosevelt traditions the hard way," one of the wrestlers said, cracking his knuckles for emphasis. Marcus felt the familiar stillness settle over him, the same focused calm his instructors in Bangkok had spent years teaching him to cultivate. Fear was natural, but it couldn't be allowed to interfere with technique. Anger was useful, but only if channeled properly. Most importantly, he needed to remember that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every Kevin Park who would come after him. "Okay," Marcus said quietly. Derek's eyes lit up with triumph. "Smart choice. Start with the shirt." Marcus reached for the bottom of his t-shirt, then paused. "Actually, I changed my mind." The words hung in the air for a moment before Derek's face twisted with rage. "You what?" "I said I changed my mind." Marcus's voice remained calm, almost conversational. "See, I've been thinking about Roosevelt traditions, and I think it's time to start some new ones." "You're about to regret that decision," the wrestler nearest to Marcus growled, taking a step forward. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But not as much as you are." The first attacker came at him with the straightforward aggression of someone accustomed to winning through size and intimidation rather than skill. Marcus sidestepped the clumsy charge and drove his elbow into the wrestler's ribs with the precision of years of Muay Thai training. The impact was devastating, not just the force, but the placement, targeting nerve clusters that would send shooting pain through his opponent's entire torso. The wrestler dropped to his knees, gasping and clutching. His side. The sound of his pain echoed off the locker room walls, and for a moment, everyone froze in shock. "What the hell?" Derek started to say, then rushed forward with his fists raised. Marcus had been waiting for this. Derek's anger made him predictable, his technique sloppy. Marcus deflected the wild haymaker with his left forearm and responded with a perfectly timed elbow strike to Derek's temple. Not hard enough to cause permanent damage, but precise enough to send Derek stumbling backward, blood streaming from a cut above his eyebrow. The second wrestler was smarter than his partner, approaching with more caution and better technique. But Marcus had trained against opponents who competed internationally, who understood timing and distance in ways that high school athletes couldn't match. When the wrestler shot for a takedown, Marcus sprawled expertly and caught him with a knee strike to the solar plexus that dropped him to the floor. Retching, Derek's two remaining followers looked at each other uncertainly, clearly not expecting their prey to fight back so effectively. Marcus could see them reconsidering their commitment to the confrontation. "Anyone else?" Marcus asked, his breathing still controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Cameron stepped forward, his expression shifting from confident authority to something approaching respect. "That was impressive," he admitted. "But you're still outnumbered." 3-on-1 now, Marcus pointed out. "Better odds than a minute ago." "You can't fight all of us forever," Derek wheezed, using his shirt to wipe blood from his face. "I don't need to fight you forever," Marcus replied. "Just long enough to make my point." Cameron studied him carefully, as if seeing Marcus clearly for the first time. "And what point is that?" "That some traditions need to change. That stronger people should protect weaker ones, not prey on them." Marcus gestured toward the 3 injured boys. "This is what happens when bullies meet someone who fights back." The locker room fell silent except for the labored breathing of the wounded. Marcus remained in the center of the space, balanced and ready, but not advancing. He'd made his point. Without causing permanent damage, professional, controlled, devastating. "This isn't over," Derek said finally, struggling to his feet. "Yes, it is," Cameron said quietly, surprising everyone in the room. Derek stared at his leader in shock. "What?" "I said it's over." Cameron's voice carried absolute authority. "Look around, Derek. Look at what just happened here." Marcus watched carefully as Cameron processed the situation. The quarterback was clearly intelligent enough to recognize when a strategy had failed completely. "You're serious?" Derek asked. "Dead serious." Cameron looked at Marcus with what might have been grudging admiration. "We picked the wrong target." Over the next few minutes, Cameron took charge of the aftermath with the same efficiency he showed on the football field. The injured wrestlers were helped to their feet and given basic first aid. Derek's cut was cleaned and bandaged. The locker room was checked for any evidence of the confrontation. "No one talks about this," Cameron announced to his crew. "Not to coaches, not to friends, not to anyone. What happened here stays here." As the group prepared to leave, Cameron approached Marcus one final time. "You could have seriously hurt them." He observed. "I could have," Marcus agreed. "I chose not to." "Why?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Because the point wasn't to cause damage. It was to stop the damage you've been causing." Cameron nodded slowly. "The freshman Kevin Park, Derek won't bother him anymore." "Good. And neither will anyone else in my crew. Even better." Cameron extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Marcus shook it. "New traditions," Cameron said. "New traditions," Marcus agreed. As the locker room emptied and normal school sounds returned to the hallways, Marcus remained behind for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. He'd used violence to solve a problem, something his martial arts instructors had always taught should be a last resort. But sometimes, he reflected, last resorts were necessary to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. When Marcus finally emerged from the locker room, he found Kevin Park waiting nervously by the water fountains. "I heard there was some kind of fight," Kevin said anxiously. "Are you okay?" Marcus smiled, genuinely touched by the younger boy's concern. "I'm fine, and I think you're going to be fine too." "What do you mean?" I think Roosevelt's traditions are about to change for the better." As they walked toward the main entrance together, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving at Roosevelt High School, a sense of belonging. Not because he'd won a fight, but because he'd used his strength to protect someone who needed protection. Outside, his father was waiting in the pickup lane, reading construction plans as usual. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, and David looked up with his typical mild curiosity. "How was school today?" Marcus thought about Derek's bloodied face, Cameron's grudging respect, and Kevin's grateful smile. "Educational," he said finally. As they drove home through the suburban streets of Denver, Marcus reflected on the past 3 weeks. He'd come to Roosevelt hoping for anonymity and academic success. Instead, he'd found himself at the center of a conflict that had tested everything he'd learned about courage, violence, and standing up for others. The smart thing would have been to avoid confrontation, to work within the system, to let others handle problems that weren't technically his responsibility. But Marcus had learned something important about himself in that locker room. Sometimes being smart wasn't as important as being brave. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the dangerous thing to do. And sometimes traditions that seemed permanent could be changed by one person willing to stand up and say, "Enough." As Roosevelt High School disappeared in the rearview mirror, Marcus was already looking forward to tomorrow. There would be homework to complete, friendships to nurture, and maybe even a few more traditions to change. But for the first time since arriving in Denver, he felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The following weeks brought unexpected changes to Roosevelt's social landscape. Word of the locker room incident had somehow spread despite Cameron's orders for silence, though the details became increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. Some students claimed Marcus had single-handedly defeated the entire wrestling team. Others whispered that he was a secret government agent trained in deadly martial arts. Marcus found the rumors both amusing and exhausting. During lunch periods, younger students would approach his table with a mixture of awe and nervousness, asking if the stories were true. He deflected most questions with humor, but privately he was pleased to notice that incidents of bullying throughout the school had decreased dramatically. The most significant change was in Cameron himself. The quarterback had evolved from intimidating enforcer to something approaching a legitimate leader. Marcus observed him intervening in potential conflicts, but with words rather than threats. When a group of seniors started hassling a student with disabilities, Cameron shut it down immediately, not through intimidation, but by making it clear that such behavior was beneath Roosevelt's standards. "It's weird," Emma commented one afternoon, as they watched Cameron help a freshman who dropped his books. 6 months ago, that same freshman would have been Cameron's target. Now Cameron's protecting him. "People can change," Sarah offered thoughtfully. "Maybe Cameron just needed someone to show him a different way." Jessica looked skeptical. "Or maybe he's just scared of getting his butt kicked again." Marcus shook his head. "It's not fear. Cameron's too proud for that. I think he genuinely realized that being strong doesn't mean making other people weak." The conversation was interrupted by Tyler Williams jogging over to their table, excitement radiating from his usually reserved demeanor. "Marcus, Coach wants to see you," Tyler announced breathlessly. "Coach Williams? What for?" "Wrestling tryouts started yesterday, and apparently word got back to him about your skills. He wants to know if you're interested in joining the team." Marcus felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and wariness. Organized sports meant increased visibility, potential scholarship opportunities, but also integration into the very social structure he'd worked to change. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd ask you," Tyler replied. "But Marcus, this could be huge. Dad's coached 3 state champions, and he's never personally recruited someone mid-semester." The offer was tempting. Marcus missed the physical challenge of regular training, the disciplined structure of competitive athletics. But wrestling was a far cry from Muay Thai. and he wondered if his striking-based background would translate effectively to grappling. "I'll think about it," Marcus said finally. That evening, he called his former instructor in Bangkok, Master Chai, for guidance. The conversation, conducted in a mixture of English and Thai, lasted nearly an hour as Marcus explained his situation and the unexpected opportunity. "Competition teaches patience," Master Chai said finally. "In Thailand, we say the strongest fighter is one who never needs to prove his strength. But sometimes, young warriors, proving strength once prevents the need to prove it many times. You think I should join the team? I think you should follow the path that allows you to protect others while honoring your training. If wrestling accomplishes this, then wrestle. If it does not, then find another way." The next morning, Marcus found himself outside Coach Williams' office 15 minutes before first period. The walls were covered with team photos dating back decades, newspaper clippings highlighting championship victories, and motivational posters featuring intense-looking athletes in various poses of determination. Coach Williams himself was exactly what Marcus had expected, a compact, muscular man in his late 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years pushing teenagers to exceed their perceived limitations. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his direct gaze suggested someone accustomed to reading characters quickly. "Tyler tells me you've got some fighting experience," Coach Williams began without preamble. "Some martial arts training, yes sir." "What kind?" "Muay Thai primarily. Some basic grappling, but not much formal wrestling." Coach Williams leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus carefully. "Muay Thai is a striking art. Wrestling's all about control, leverage, technique over power. The skill sets don't necessarily overlap." "I understand that, sir. But," Coach Williams continued, "the mental discipline does transfer. And from what I've heard, you've got the kind of competitive fire we look for in our athletes." Marcus remained silent, unsure how much Coach Williams actually knew about recent events. "Here's what I'm thinking," the coach said finally. "Wrestling season's already started, so you'd be behind the curve on technique. But if you're willing to put in extra work, morning practices, one-on-one coaching, accelerated learning, I think you could catch up quickly enough to contribute before the season's end." The offer was more generous than Marcus had expected. "What would you expect in return?" "Commitment, discipline, leadership by example." Coach Williams paused meaningfully. "And help change some attitudes on the team." The last point clarified everything. Coach Williams knew exactly what had happened in the locker room, and he was looking for someone to help reshape his team's culture from the inside. "When would I start?" "Practice is at 6 a.m. tomorrow. Be here at 5:45 for equipment." Fitting, Marcus spent the rest of the day mentally preparing for a return to serious athletic training. His friends were excited about the news, though Emma expressed concern about the time commitment affecting his academic performance. Wrestling practice plus a P classes plus Model UN. "When are you going to sleep?" she asked during lunch. "I'll manage," Marcus replied, though privately he shared her concern. The first wrestling practice was a revelation. Marcus had expected the physical challenge hours of drilling techniques, conditioning exercises that left his legs shaking, and sparring sessions that tested every aspect of fitness. What surprised him was the immediate acceptance from his new teammates. Derek was notably absent from the wrestling room, having apparently decided that football conditioning was more appealing than facing Marcus on the mats. But the other wrestlers, including the two who'd been in the locker room that day, treated Marcus with professional respect. No lingering resentment, no attempts at revenge, just the shared understanding of athletes focused on improvement. Cameron, who served as an unofficial team captain despite being primarily a football player, pulled Marcus aside after the first week of practice. "Coach asked me to check on how you're adjusting," Cameron said as they walked toward the parking lot. "Fine, I think. The technique's different from what I'm used to, but the conditioning is similar." Cameron nodded. Listen, I want to say something about what happened a few weeks ago. Marcus waited, curious about where this conversation was heading. I've been thinking a lot about leadership lately, Cameron continued. Real leadership, not just intimidation. What you did in that locker room, that was leadership. Taking a risk to protect someone weaker. You would have done the same thing. No, Cameron said firmly. I wouldn't have. That's what I'm trying to change about myself. They reached Marcus's father's car, where David was waiting with his usual patience and construction blueprints. One more thing, Cameron said. The state wrestling tournament is in 6 weeks. Coach thinks you might be ready to compete by then, depending on how quickly you pick up the techniques. The prospect of competing after only 6 weeks of formal wrestling training seemed impossible. But Marcus had learned not to underestimate his ability to adapt quickly when properly motivated. We'll see, Marcus replied as his father drove them home. Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 months. He'd arrived at Roosevelt hoping for anonymity and found himself at the center of social transformation. He'd avoided athletic commitment and was now training for state-level competition. Most importantly, he'd discovered that his martial arts skills weren't just about personal protection. They were tools for creating positive change in his community. How's the wrestling going? David asked, interrupting his thoughts. Different from Muay Thai, but good, really good. Your mother's worried about overcommitment. Between advanced classes and athletics, you're carrying a heavy load. Marcus considered this. His academic performance hadn't suffered yet, but wrestling practice meant less time for homework and Model UN preparation. Something would have to give eventually. I can handle it, he said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. I'm sure you can. Just remember that balance is important. Your martial arts training in Bangkok taught you about physical balance. Now you need to learn about life balance. That evening, Marcus video called Master Somchai to update him on the wrestling development. His old instructor listened thoughtfully as Marcus demonstrated some of the techniques he'd learned, offering suggestions for adapting his Muay Thai footwork to wrestling's lower stance requirements. Remember, Master Somchai said before ending the call, every martial art teaches the same fundamental lesson: respect for others, discipline for yourself, and strength used only when necessary. Wrestling is just another path to the same destination. As Marcus prepared for bed, he looked ahead to the coming weeks with a mixture of anticipation and determination. 6 weeks to learn enough wrestling technique to compete at the state level. Maintaining straight A's in the most challenging academic program Roosevelt offered. Continuing his role in reshaping the school's social culture that it seemed impossible. But then again, a few months ago, the idea of single-handedly changing Roosevelt High School's bullying problem had seemed impossible too, and that had worked out pretty well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.